All right, in this video, we're going to talk about peaks, clusters, and gaps. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a peak, which is also known as the mode. Remember, we talked about dot plots before, and we said the highest stack is also called the mode. Well, it's also called the peak of the data. And here, if we were to look at the peak of the data, we would say the peak or the mode of the data is at 10 because it is the highest point on this graph. Here, we would also say that the data is clustered. The data is clustered at 10 to 12. Now, remember, you can think of clusters like kids in the hallway. Like whenever you and your friends are in the hallway, y'all cluster into groups. So you can think of a cluster that way. Hopefully that helps relate to you. So if you see here, the cluster is from 10 to 12 because most of the data is clustered around those numbers. Now, a gap is where there isn't any data at all. It's between the clusters or the data parts. So here you can see that you have a gap at 9. It's because you have data on this side of 9 and you have data on the other side of 9. But you do not have any data at 9. And over here we have a gap at 13. It's because we don't have any data at 13, but we do have data at 12 and we do have data at 14. So there is a gap at 13. Okay, let's go ahead and let's look at some examples here. So we're going to label gaps, peaks, and clusters here. I'm going to try to color code things for you. Okay, so I look for my highest point to find my peak. So I can see here that this right here is my highest point in my graph. This is my peak. It is also my mode. So if I were to ask the question, what is the peak or the mode, we would say 6. I'm going to put at 6. So the peak or the mode is at 6 here. Also now, we're going to look for the cluster. Remember, the cluster is like your group of friends in the hallway. And here, I can see that there's a cluster here. So here, I could say my cluster starts at 4 and goes to 10. So cluster, I'm going to put here 4 to 10. And I do have some gaps here as well. I do have some spaces where there is no data at all. I have a gap at 3. And I do have another gap over here. See how there's no data? I have a gap at, it starts at 11 and goes to 13. So gap at 11 to 13. Okay? Pretty easy on that one. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's look at one that looks like this. So here, if I were to find my peak, I do not see any point that's higher than any other point on here. So there is no peak. Here, if I were to look at the cluster, well, everything's clustered here. So I would say no cluster. Because everything is the same everywhere. Then I don't see any blank spaces. Every data has the same amount with no spaces, so there are no gaps. Not every graph has to have a peak, a cluster, or gaps. Here we actually call this a uniform graph because everything looks exactly the same. Okay. Let's go ahead and let's look at this graph. And I see here that my highest point, this one kind of looks high, but I see one that looks a little bit higher. So here would be my peak, and it would also be known as my mode, which is at 10. So my peak of this graph, or my mode of this graph, would be 10. Now, if I was looking for clusters, I actually have 2 clusters in this case. I see that here's all the friends in the hallway clustering around. Okay, so here's a cluster. We have a cluster from 0 to 5. And I have another cluster over here. So we have another group of friends in the hallway. And I see here we have a cluster from 8 to 12. Now, there is part right here where there is nothing. So we call this the gap. And the gap is from 6 to 7. It's where no information is. Okay? All right, this last one here. We can see here that the highest point, our peak, is at 2. Remember, our peak is also known as our mode, is at 2. And if we noticed here, we have all the information is kind of already clustered together. So we could say that the information is clustered at 0 to 4. But there doesn't appear to be any gaps. There's no spaces in between. So here we can say no gaps. Okay. All right. Hope that helps.